I want to spend a few minutes just sort of talking about kind of the landscape and some initial challenges of providing high-speed rail in the U.S. There isn't really high-speed rail in terms of a true national network, like we might think of in a place like Germany or France or one of the systems in Europe or Japan, isn't necessarily all that feasible, I don't think, in the United States. And that's simply because to quote the gentleman with the fantastic mustache who ran for governor in New York a couple years ago, the country is too damn big. But there are, however, several very interesting corridors that match up similar to what a national system might look like in one of the countries of Western Europe, or Eastern Europe for that matter, or Japan. For connecting various cities, various large cities that are, up to a couple hundred miles apart along the west coast, through the southwest, through the state of Texas, in the southeast, the Midwest, Great Plains, and then especially in the Northeast. And so that together, while wouldn't necessarily be an optimally connected national network, would sort of make a de facto high-speed rail network that would be really useful. The things that it would be useful for, that I think particularly stand out in the U.S., that there are two problems related to sustainability and transport in the U.S. that a high-speed rail, a regionally based de facto high-speed rail network would address. One of those is the issue of short-haul airline flights. These are, in terms of their, per capita, per mile, per energy use impact on the environment and on society, they tend to be much worse. The biggest thing, much worse than a longer flight. The biggest thing about air travel in terms of pollution and congestion is taking off and landing. Once a plane's in the air, there's not as big a difference and not as big an impact pollution-wise. The trips that a regional high-speed rail network might fit would go a long way towards replacing some of those short-haul flights that could have a tremendous impact both environmentally as well as on the national airport network, which is pretty congested, especially through some of the hub airports in some of these regions. A second benefit has to do with intercity travel by the car between these similar sets of cities. A lot of these areas, most of these areas, have interstate systems that are pretty well congested and seemingly always under construction or reconstruction. A high-speed rail network in a regional environment like that would serve to help alleviate some of that congestion. And even though there would be a price premium relative to driving, there are other advantages that such a trip would provide. High-speed network would be faster, hopefully, thinking some along the lines of 2 to 3 times faster, though some people tend to drive a little more aggressively on the road than others. You can also, you're free to work or free to socialize. You're not responsible for navigating the car. So there are some pretty notable benefits that a high-speed network would provide for the transport geography of the U.S. But there's 3 main challenges that I want to spend the rest of my time talking about that make it problematic, and they're questions that aren't the things that are typically addressed. Usually the big thing is always cost, and well, yes, of course it's going to be expensive. Anything that large is going to be expensive. The first issue that I want to discuss has to do with engineering and right-of-way challenges. The U.S. has less than half of the rail mileage that it did at its peak in the late 19th, early 20th century, and has approximately the same amount of railroad mileage track as it did in 1840. For some reference, in 1840, the President of the United States was Martin Van Buren. The Civil War was 21 years away from starting. The telephone had not yet been invented, and Italy was not a country. But that is the level at which our current track infrastructure exists. Furthermore, this infrastructure is not exactly in great shape. It is what remains, what hasn't been removed or unused, is often deferred maintenance is often practiced on it. So top speeds are not really even capable on a lot of this track. Even if top speeds were capable for it, though, a lot of the track isn't engineered to handle what would be true high-speed rail. When Amtrak talks about having high-speed rail in the Northeast, they're talking about a train that can get up to a little over 100 miles an hour in certain sections of the corridor between Washington, D.C. and Boston. That's not true high-speed rail in the sense of the speeds that are reached in Europe and in Japan, or in some of the, to get really futuristic, some of the maglev lines that are being talked about, and there's one in China that gets upwards of 300 miles an hour in between destinations. You would have to have the high-speed rail component for it to provide enough of a competitive advantage to be used and to sustain competition against intercity travel in the car and short-haul airline flights. the engineering and the right-of-way for that doesn't exist right now. So you're talking about a whole set of interstate right-of-way problems. Now, I don't think that's impossible to overcome. The example I give in the paper is the idea of some kind of an elevated line where over rural areas people lease out space sort of in the similar way that some farmers and ranchers will lease out space for the use of windmills. And you have this kind of image of, sort of cows wandering oblivious in a farm in Wisconsin between, Madison and Chicago as this train shoots over it. So it's not, I don't know that it's impossible, but I just don't think the creative thinking has been there to consider it in most of the discussion. There's also a question of who exactly is going to provide the service. There isn't really a company that has a lot of experience with intercity rail travel. There are some, the closest thing that I do think exists is in the form of some of the public transit operators that operate in, multiple counties or in cities that are spread out over multiple counties or multiple jurisdictions, some of the regional rail authorities. But it's not immediately clear who would provide it. And you would expect there to be a lot of resistance from, for example, the auto industry as well as the airline industry, which, as you may have noticed, hasn't exactly been doing a terribly wonderful business since in the post 9/11 world. You might consider that these people might, offer these things, but it's tough to imagine, airline people getting in the rail business, and there's a bit of a vacuum as far as who and how it would actually actively be provided. You can imagine some resistance to it being publicly provided and heavy public investment in terms of a service provider, but it also doesn't seem like the market is sort of ready to provide somebody for it yet. The startup costs of service provision are also going to be incredibly high. Would the service provider be responsible for this infrastructure they're going to have to build? How would it be incentivized? There are just a lot of questions there that we really haven't addressed. Lastly, it has to do with something, the last thing that I think needs considered has to do with something that I call challenges of the last mile. Okay, if you're talking about having these things replace short-haul airline service, you're going to need connections of the rail to airports, all right, so that you still feed the hub system or however the hub system would evolve. And I think there are enough intercity central city rail lines that go to their airports. So I think there's the engineering and the connection existing for that to be placed in. But there's an issue of once you connect these cities and connect these places, then what? A lot of our cities outside of a place like this don't have really good transit access, especially outside of the central city. So you'd have a lot of people that would increase their connectivity to the city, but once you're within the city, how do you then get around? If you're taking of the analogy of an airport, well, there's taxis, rental cars, and then somebody picking you up. And I don't know that a burgeoning rental car and taxi industry is really what central city roadways really need to add to them. So there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of how you would fit that. The related also to that last mile problem is how frequently the thing is going to stop. We've already had sort of one era of train travel in the U.S., in the original era of development, where there were a fair number of small to mid-sized towns that essentially withered up and died because the train bypassed them. While that scenario is probably a little extreme, it does raise an interesting question of how frequently would the thing stop. You imagine a travel line between, let's say, Chicago and Louisville, Kentucky. All right, since I'm more familiar with Indiana transport geography from my time there. So clearly it would stop in Indianapolis, and that's good. But there are a lot of places in between, potentially in between Louisville and Indianapolis, and then Indianapolis and Chicago that might be good places for it to stop. Would it stop in Bloomington, Indiana, where Indiana University is? Well, maybe so. There was probably a fair bit of demand for regional travel there, as well as access to an airport. But then, how far do you keep going with that question? How frequently does it stop? If it stops too frequently, it loses the speed advantage that it gets, unless it travels really, really fast in between stops, which doesn't, the more frequently you stop, the more difficult that is to achieve. If it stops too infrequently, then you limit too much access to the train, and so you're limiting the amount of potential demand that you have from it. So there's just, to wrap up, I just wanted to highlight these three issues that I think are really central questions to any potential high-speed rail system. I definitely think it can work. My research and interests are in transit. I certainly hope it can work, or I'm betting on the wrong horse with my research agenda. But the questions that we see always, at least in the political environment, always sort of start and end with cost, which is kind of a, I don't want to say an irrelevant question, but we should not be surprised that it is going to be expensive. We should not be surprised that we're going to have questions of how we're going to pay for it. What we should instead, I think, maybe consider and start answering are what are some of the specifics going to look like to make this thing really work if it's something we want to invest in. So, thank you.